speaker.
Dr. Lee, can you
Yes,
can you just repeat what you just said?
what I just said. Okay, what I said. Okay, the main goal of our webinar project is to research and archive any material that we could find, specifically the primary sources, and then we wanted to put it in some repository. In the beginning, we want to put it in some online repository, but we wanted to eventually find some archiving center offsite so that can be used by various purposes later on. So we started February 2006, and then we have it's been 6, 7 months past. So this pilot program will be end today. The Professor Margaret Stetz is our last guest speaker, and she's going to talk like 40, 45 minutes maybe. And then we are going to have an interactive session so that you can, offer your ideas. You can ask some questions. Only 10 participants for now, but not for the public.
Okay, great.
Introduce yourself, Professor.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much for arranging this, and thanks always to WCCW for the marvelous work that it's been doing now for decades. I have such tremendous admiration and respect for everything associated with WCCW and its wonderful programs and its activism. My lecture, which I will be reading, and please forgive me, you'll see me looking down at the paper instead of always looking up at the camera, but my lecture is titled Teaching Comfort Women Issues, The Hidden Stories of Girls. The concepts we use to frame sexual violence and the kinds of language we employ in doing so can make an enormous difference. Recently, we've witnessed a vivid illustration of this in the United States, especially those of us who work in academic environments. After decades when campus sexual assault was a concern rarely addressed by colleges and universities in any sustained or official way, it is now a front burner issue everywhere at the highest administrative levels. What changed was the relabeling of sexual violence on campuses as a violation of Title IX, which mandates gender equity, and thus as a problem under federal jurisdiction, now overseen actively by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. Very rapidly, it has ceased to be regarded as a wrong that involves merely individual perpetrators and survivors, and instead has become something for which institutions are answerable to government investigators. I invoke this example to suggest that reframing instances of wartime sexual violence, too, could potentially have a transformative impact. The place, moreover, to begin this process is in educational settings, such as classrooms, academic conferences, and symposia, where those of us who teach for a living have the greatest control over what information gets communicated and how to present it. I would like, therefore, to see scholars reclassify what has been known as the, quote, comfort women issue of World War II. It has already been recast several times since coming to attention first in Asia and then across the globe in the early and mid-1990s, through the circulation of public testimony by small groups of survivors, as well as the establishment of organizations to support their demands for apologies and reparations from the Japanese government. And of course, that includes wonderful organizations like WCCW. With the new international definition in the 1990s of rape as a war crime, and with the first prosecutions in 1996 of Bosnian Serb military officials by the International Criminal Tribunal of The Hague under it, the sexual abuse, exploitation, and imprisonment in brothels of Asian women by the Japanese Imperial Army during the 1930s and 1940s was also recategorized as a matter falling under the designation of rape as a war crime, and as one, moreover, that had never been addressed specifically by post-war tribunals assessing Japan's responsibility for wartime atrocities. At the same time, that is, in the mid to late 1990s, many activists chose to discard the euphemistic term comfort system in favor of the phrase military sexual slavery, to emphasize its seriousness and also to link it to other forms of human rights abuse involving both slavery and sexual violence. Despite this combination of linguistic and legal advances, along with political activism on behalf of survivors, the so-called comfort woman issue has proven an intractable problem. The announcement at the end of December 2015 of an ambiguous agreement between the governments of South Korea and Japan, whereby the former would cease to press claims on behalf of Korean survivors of the comfort system, and the latter would acknowledge having wronged the victims and offer some financial compensation, has settled nothing. The survivors themselves, who were never consulted in the drafting of this agreement, have rejected it, as have multiple groups of their advocates. Meanwhile, Japanese nationalists and other comfort system deniers have gone on insisting that no such war crime ever existed, and that those confined to military brothels were really professional sex workers who were there voluntarily, or that their sufferings were entirely due to the actions of independent brothel managers, unsanctioned by the Japanese government or by military authorities. In February 2016, further controversy arose when, less than 2 months after the agreement, Shinsuke Sugiyama, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Japan, renewed an old claim before a United Nations panel that no evidence exists of either the Imperial Japanese Army or the World War II-era Japanese government having forced women into military brothels. The agreement itself, moreover, while committing the South Korean government to future silence on this matter, does not commit the Japanese government to future speech. It requires no public education in Japan, no teaching about this history in school textbooks or in other media. And, of course, whatever the virtues, limitations, or failures of such a two-nation pact, it has no application at all to the situation of survivors in the many other parts of Asia, including China, Taiwan, Indonesia, and the Philippines, from which thousands of victims were shipped to battlefront brothels. The situation remains at an impasse. At the same time, this agreement has had no effect whatsoever on another continuing dilemma. That is, the seeming lack of interest in the West in educating about this history in classrooms, where its absence from most curricula stands in striking contrast to the ongoing presence of European Holocaust-related subjects. The Holocaust is presumed to offer crucial lessons for the present and future. The story of the comfort system is not. Remarkably few students hear anything whatsoever about the comfort system in middle schools or secondary schools or even in undergraduate world history courses. As there is little knowledge or understanding on the part of the public about this, there is also virtually no political pressure coming from the West. Nothing to encourage the Japanese government to deal directly with the survivors in South Korea or in any other Asian country, such as China or the Philippines, or to treat its legal responsibility for the comfort system as an established part of the historical record in textbooks and in future official pronouncements. The question, therefore, is whether scholars can help to move matters forward toward a settlement of the so-called comfort system problem, a resolution that would also be in the best interests of Japan, as it would remove a shadow overhanging its reputation in the area of human rights. Can we help to reframe the issue in a way that makes clearer why this was not a system of voluntary prostitution involving choice or agency on the part of those in the military brothels? Can we place this history, too, in a light that will emphasize why it should be taught widely today and in the future, whether in Asia or in the West, by making plain how it links directly to pressing universal human rights concerns, such as questions involving the movement of human cargo across borders. With these goals in mind, I would like to encourage the teaching of this topic not solely or even primarily in terms of wartime sexual violence against women per se, but instead as a historical instance of organized child sex abuse and child sex trafficking. Given the potentially inflammatory nature of those terms, anyone employing them must be careful to state from the outset that to apply them retrospectively to the situation that pertained in the Asia-Pacific War is not to accuse the Japanese Imperial Army of having done something in any way unique, either during World War II or in respect to any other armed conflict. As Maki Kimura states in her 2016 study, Unfolding the Comfort Women Debates, quote, "In the early discussion of the comfort women system, the system was often understood to reflect Japanese uniqueness, but there was also a strong awareness that war crimes, including wartime sexual violence against women, is not unique to Japan." End quote. Likewise, sexual violence against underage girls and children was scarcely a phenomenon limited to the Asian front. In his 2007 volume, Taken by Force, Rape and American GIs in Europe During World War II, Robert Lilly has documented, for instance, sexual abuse in France by the same American forces that were supposedly there to liberate the French. Quote, "The ages of the victims in France varied, ranging from 10 to 74 years. The victims included children, the elderly, married, single, virgins, mothers, and pregnant women." End quote. The record was even more appalling when it came to sexual violence committed by American troops in Germany at the end of the war and afterwards. Lilly reports on the case of, quote, 3-year-old Ingrid C., who was asleep at home in Auerbach, Germany, on August 21, 1945, when an intruder broke into the home. The next morning, an American soldier, Private Gilbert F. Newbern, was found lying beside Ingrid, who was naked from the waist down and who had blood on her body, end quote. Private Newbern, quote, "was fully clothed except for his trousers. They were on the floor and they had blood on the front," end quote. Newbern was tried and convicted of rape. Quote, "Consent was not an issue at his trial because of the child's age. It was noted that at common law, all sexual intercourse with a girl of tender age was criminal, as she was conclusively presumed not to have consented," end quote. While this rape of a 3-year-old by an American soldier may seem an aberration, the targeting of young girls in general for sexual assault was not. Based on an examination of existing evidence from the files of the JAGS Board of Review, Lilly concludes that in Germany, quote, teenagers were raped more often than any other age category, the youngest 13, the oldest 19. They comprised 40% of the known ages of the girls who were violated by members of the US military. These particular crimes against female children in Europe were not, of course, part of any organized or institutionalized system. But there are other examples of Allied forces, especially in the aftermath of the war in Asia, subjecting underage Japanese girls to more systematic sexual violence. Indeed, of perpetuating some of the same practices associated with the comfort system, such as forcible recruitment, rape, and confinement, but for the benefit of American soldiers. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese academic who has long been an advocate for the claims of the survivors of the comfort system and a committed supporter of the movement for official acknowledgement of all war crimes, regardless of which nation perpetrated them, tells one of these long-silenced post-war stories in his book, Japan's Comfort Women. Quote, a dozen high school students were staying at a dormitory in Hiroshima Prefecture. They had become war orphans when, on August 6, 1945, their families had perished and their homes had been destroyed by the atomic bomb. They were put into a truck and taken away. First, they were taken into a house in an unknown place where they were gang raped by a number of GIs. Eventually, they were taken to a comfort station, end quote. In this case, of course, the comfort station would have been called a brothel, though it involved just as little choice or consent on the part of those who were imprisoned within it and sexually violated. This, too, was an example of military-sanctioned sexual assault and of the targeting of young girls for sex trafficking, even though it may not have been conducted on as wide a scale as the comfort system or involved as much bureaucratic planning. In the decades since the Second World War, seeking out very young girls specifically for sexual exploitation by military and paramilitary groups has, if anything, become the norm rather than the exception, which is all the more reason why the, quote, hidden history, end quote, of Japan's comfort system remains relevant and vital to know as well as to teach. In 2015, Evelyn Amoni published the memoir of her abduction from Uganda and her years in captivity, first as a child laborer and then as one of the numerous so-called wives of the notorious Joseph Kony, head of the Lord's Resistance Army, a rebel force opposed to the Ugandan government. As Amoni has recounted, quote, I had just turned 14 years old when I became Kony's wife. One day, Kony called all of his wives to the house and told them that I was to be his wife. He told me that I could not refuse. I asked him, how can I be your wife when up until this point you have called me your child? He said, you have no choice. You must be my wife. My reaction was just run to escape, so I did. Kony sent his bodyguards after me, and they caned me 50 strokes on the back and buttocks to punish me for embarrassing him before others. After they were done with beating me, Kony said that it was my parents' fault for giving birth to such a beautiful girl, end quote. Currently, it is the practice, too, of the Nigerian extremist fighters known as Boko Haram, who have now allied themselves with the forces of the Islamic State, to abduct very young girls and to take them as, quote, wives. In an incident that received widespread publicity internationally in 2014, Boko Haram members seized 250 schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria, and carried them off. A few of the girls were seen alive on a video released to the media in August 2016. In that video, as a correspondent for the New York Times has reported, quote, "At least one is holding a small child, a troubling reminder of fears that the girls have been forced to marry militants," end quote. There is, in other words, nothing culturally specific and, unfortunately, nothing at all unusual about the fact young girls were an important part of the comfort system of World War II. Neither has it been uncommon, however, for the significance of such targeting based on age to be ignored or discounted by those who study warfare, its strategies and practices, and its victims. In her study, War is Not Over When It's Over, Women Speak Out from the Ruins of War, from 2010, Anne Jones, a feminist writer and activist, has reminded readers that amidst, quote, "the violence of war, children are orphaned, maimed, mutilated, sexually assaulted, kidnapped, forced to be soldiers or servants or sex slaves, tortured and murdered," end quote. Yet the situations and the particular sufferings of the young have been largely overlooked or rendered invisible, whether in the world at large or in academic studies, especially when those have involved girls. When it comes to matters related to warfare, feminist researchers, as Cynthia Enlow puts the matter, quote, "have quite wisely focused their primary attention on women's experiences. For other sorts of researchers usually have, quote, privileged men's experiences only." Until recently, however, not even feminist historians and theorists, who have done so much in general to educate readers about war as a gendered phenomenon, have examined carefully how a war-related trauma, such as military sexual assault and imprisonment in brothels, affects younger victims. Even at the level of language, the deliberate targeting and exploitation of girls has been erased through commonly used phrases such as the, quote, "wartime rape of women" and, quote, "sexual violence against women." It is time, therefore, to reconsider questions of rhetoric and discourse, to refer exclusively to the comfort women issue or even to military sexual slavery when we address this particular war crime of World War II, which involved the sexual assault of several 100,000 Asian females, is to risk papering over the disturbing reality of child rape that was endemic to it. Laura Berberon-Renares has quite rightly stated in Sex Trafficking in Post-Colonial Literature that, quote, "the majority of the comfort women were slaves chosen for systematic rape because of their structural condition. They were poor, colonized women," end quote. Berberon-Renares' emphasis on colonization as a crucial underpinning for the comfort system is an important contribution. This should not, however, obscure the fact that an equally significant element defining the structural condition of those chosen for exploitation was age, and that many were not women at all, but rather girl children. In his introduction to the English language testimony of Maria Rosa Henson, which was published in the US in 1999 under the title Comfort Woman, Yuki Tanaka writes the following, quote, "Another distinctive feature of comfort women in the Philippines is that they became victims of military sexual violence at very young ages. The average age in the comfort stations for which we have information is 17.6 years. Many were younger than 15 years, and one was as young as 10 years. Naturally, the younger girls had not yet begun to menstruate. An explanation for why the Japanese victimized such young girls will require further investigation." End quote. Here, it is heartening to see a scholar of the comfort system raising the issue of how and why young girls in particular were targeted for sexual violence, but frustrating that he leaves it unexplored. Although Tanaka offered this stimulus to other researchers nearly 2 decades ago, the desired, quote, "further investigation," end quote, has not yet been forthcoming. Certainly, the narrative of Maria Rosa Henson, who was gang raped outside Manila at age 14 by a group of passing Japanese soldiers, then abducted later and confined to a military brothel for 9 months at age 15, suggests a few tentative answers. For one thing, the younger and more physiologically undeveloped the girl, the more useful she proved. As Henson testifies, quote, "Every Wednesday, a Japanese doctor came to give us a checkup. The other women could rest for 4 or 5 days a month while they had their period. But I had no rest because I was not yet menstruating." End quote. A comfort station stocked with young girls who could be exploited for the full 30 days each month without interruption was a machine running at maximum efficiency. So too, since condom use by the Japanese soldiers was voluntary and impossible to enforce, girls not yet menstruating were more desirable for another reason. They were less likely to become pregnant, and thus to be, in effect, temporarily out of service while recuperating from the forced abortions that usually followed on order of the doctors who oversaw these girls. In the comfort station, moreover, where, as Maria Rosa Henson reports, quote, "Every day anywhere from 10 to over 20 soldiers raped me," end quote, many of the soldiers themselves were young, quote, "maybe only 18 years old," end quote, yet also extremely brutal, taking out their frustrations and anger of various sorts on her and on the other captive Filipinas by beating them. That some of the girls were even younger than these adolescent soldiers, as well as of a supposedly inferior ethnicity, made it easy for the latter to feel superior to them, and therefore to use them freely to relieve stress, whether by raping them or by punching and slapping them. The main point was to affirm the soldier's sense of absolute power over a powerless other, and thus to provide opportunities for both physical and psychological release in order to keep these young men, too, performing efficiently. Very young girls served this purpose well. As Maki Kimura has noted, quote, "Despite the strong link between licensed prostitution in Japan and the comfort women system, such as the compulsory VD examination of women and commodifying and consuming women's bodies and sexuality to enhance masculinity and national strength, there were important differences between the two systems. For one thing, the comfort women who had to serve military personnel during armed conflict were more likely to suffer various forms of violence than licensed prostitutes," end quote. Maria Rosa Henson was not alone among young girls held in military brothels who were subjected to particularly vicious and brutal attacks by the soldiers, as the helplessness magnified by their youth, seemed to exacerbate the temptation to commit violence against them. The Japanese historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki has reported in his book Comfort Women, which was translated into English in 2000, that there was little reason for soldiers to refrain from unleashing such physical assaults. Quote, even in those cases of violent behavior that came to light, the perpetrators were not severely punished. End quote. Yoshiaki also points, moreover, to important evidence regarding awareness of the issue of age on the part of Japanese governmental representatives who oversaw and enforced sex trafficking during the war. Officials who made distinctions that also reflected racial hierarchies. According to Yoshiaki, any time that women of Japanese birth and ethnicity were, quote, to be sent overseas to work as prostitutes, they had to be over the age of 21 and chosen from among groups of prostitutes. These restrictions were imposed by the police, end quote. Yet, as his research affirms, quote, it is clear that there were not a few cases in which, at the police's discretion, the travel of minors for the purposes of prostitution was tacitly approved, end quote. He adds, quote, especially in the case of Korean women living in Japan, these standards were not enforced, and such, quote, women and girls were instead, quote, rounded up, regardless of the fact that they were not prostitutes or were underage, sent abroad and, quote, put to work in military comfort stations. Although Yuki Tanaka may refer to the organized rape of very young girls as a, quote, distinctive feature of the occupation of the Philippines, it was in fact a common feature everywhere that the comfort system flourished. In 2000, when Sangmi Choi Shellstead collected testimonies from elderly Korean survivors for the volume Comfort Women Speak, a number of those who spoke to her told of having been forced into military brothels as underage girls. Kim Sung-hee, for instance, was 14 years old, Kang Do-kyung was 13, Kim Yun-shim was only 12. All had their childhoods viciously and instantaneously stripped from them, hence perhaps their own tendency to use the term women when describing both themselves and other victims. Jin Kyung-pang, for instance, who was abducted at the age of 14 and trafficked to Taiwan, shipped there like cargo for the use of an average of 20 Japanese soldiers a night, has said, quote, we were the first Korean women in the area, end quote, although she was still, by any definition, far from the age when she could be considered a woman. As Kang Do-kyung explains, at the time when, quote, her life became a nightmare, she did not even know the word menstruation. Sexual violation of her body preceded both physiological and psychological maturity. Such testimony, of course, counters irrefutably any claim, such as the one made repeatedly by Japanese nationalists, that the Japanese Imperial Army's sexual slaves were willing participants, allegedly able to exercise free agency and to choose prostitution. So, too, it makes doubly reprehensible the denial and suppression in Japanese school textbooks of the full story, as has occurred in recent years. The personal histories recorded by Shellstead are not unique to Koreans any more than they were to Filipinas. They have precise parallels with those of Chinese survivors, many of whom were equally young when selected for sexual abuse by the Japanese military. Pei Chu, Su Zhiliang, and Chen Lifei opened their 2013 volume about organized wartime sexual exploitation in China with the recollections of Liu Mianhuan regarding the events that followed the Japanese Imperial Army's invasion of Shaanxi province. Quote, in the year I was to turn 16, a unit of Japanese troops came and surrounded our village, and after forcing everyone to squat down, they began to pick girls out of the crowd. A Japanese military man who was about 30 years old stopped in front of me and stared at my face and said something to the interpreter, who then turned to me saying, you look very pretty. They then pulled me out. Several military men raped me that day. They hurt me so much, and I was so scared that I wished I could find a hole in the ground to hide myself. From that day on, the Japanese troops raped me every day. At that time, I was not 16 yet and hadn't had menstruation. The torture made my private parts infected and my entire body swollen." End quote. Despite featuring Liu's account of her rape as an underage, physically undeveloped girl at the start of their project, the authors nevertheless title their book Chinese Comfort Women. Their commentary, too, on her testimony avoids focusing on the question of age. Quote, "Liu Mianhuan was one of many Chinese women forced to become sex slaves for the Imperial Japanese Army during Japan's invasion of China. But for decades, the socio-political environment kept them silent, and their sufferings were excluded from the heroic post-war narratives of their nation-state." End quote. Whether such sufferings differed, either physically or mentally, for those who had not yet reached physical and emotional maturity at the time of their victimization remains unexamined. The three authors' interest is instead in moving on to what they see as the larger and more significant matter of political silencing, and moreover to the issue of how best to use Liu's and other such testimonies for the purpose of rewriting history through the recovery and dissemination of individual memory. Quote, "It is in the hope of facilitating a fuller understanding of the sufferings of the hundreds of thousands of women whose lives were ravaged by military sexual violence that this book records the stories of Chinese comfort women and tells how their agony is remembered by people in mainland China, one of the major theaters of the Second World War." End quote. The resulting volume is an invaluable addition to English language scholarship on wartime China. Yet it adds little to the fuller understanding of how and why girls in particular were subjected to systematic rape and of the ways it affected their later lives, even as it sidesteps the problem of how to cut through Japanese governmental resistance, along with Western indifference, and to make this newly unearthed history part of education, both in and outside of classrooms everywhere, as it deserves to be. That girls around the world have been and continue to be vulnerable to military rape during wartime, in fact deliberately selected for it, suggests not only why the history of the comfort system should be part of education everywhere, but why that education ought to begin early and involve both male and female students. This certainly should be a matter of concern in Japan, but also in the West. Children deserve to know what has happened in the past to girls their own age, what is still happening today, and in the case of the so-called comfort women, who were in many cases not yet women at all, what the fate of those who survived and have sought governmental acknowledgement of and official reparations for the war crimes committed against them has been. Young people need this information to develop an informed moral view of the question of warfare, of those who wage it, and of its gendered consequences. Given the realities of the past and present, it is never too soon to learn about such matters. The Republic of Korea already has proven itself a model in regard to early learning on this subject. In April 2015, the South Korean government announced that it would begin to, quote, "give teaching materials on sexual slavery instigated by the Japanese military during World War II to elementary, middle, and high school teachers, including a PowerPoint presentation, a video, guidebooks for teachers, workbooks for students, and computer-based storytelling content," end quote. Such materials would, in effect, mirror the age-appropriate resources that are already standard features of Western curricula on the topic of the European Holocaust, which introduced that equally traumatic history to school children at various stages of development. Of course, these initiatives were put in place before the late December 2015 agreement with Japan. What the future effects of that agreement might be on the national education system in South Korea are yet unknown. Meanwhile, at least one state education system in the U.S. has tested the waters in venturing to add the story of the comfort system to its textbooks. Victoria Kim's article for the Los Angeles Times gave an account in February 2016 of the uproar that followed the announcement of, quote, a draft guideline that will shape how history is taught to students throughout the public schools in California. As Kim describes it, quote, the guidelines recommend that the subject of comfort women be represented as an example of institutionalized sexual slavery and one of the largest cases of human trafficking in the 20th century, end quote. Perhaps predictably, this has engendered, quote, an online petition on change.org protesting the description. The petition asks that the passages be amended to also describe comfort women as, quote, well-paid prostitutes, and that they also served Allied troops in Japan immediately after the war, end quote. Again, if scholars emphasize the age of many of the girls who are alleged to have been, quote, prostitutes, if they remind the participants in these debates that some of these so-called comfort women were children between 10 and 15 years old, and if they begin to frame this topic not merely as one of human trafficking, but of child sex trafficking, then this can only help to undercut the continued insistence that those who were confined to military brothels had agency and autonomy. The gendered atrocities committed upon those imprisoned within the comfort system were in some ways historically specific, and in other ways part of a continuum of organized assaults in and outside of conflict zones on girls around the globe, which are still going on today. In an important work from 1997, Girls and War Zones, Troubling Questions, Carolyn Nordstrom enjoins readers to recognize links between the crimes that occurred during war and those that occur at other times. Quote, rather than seeing war abuses or child sexploitation as outside the rules and boundaries of, quote, average or, quote, normal society, perhaps we should be asking instead, what is it that makes such behaviors possible wherever they are found, and what patterns of intolerance link them, end quote. I will end my own invitation to rethink and reframe so-called comfort women issues with Nordstrom's wise words and with her reminder, quote, the plight of girls living in violent conditions challenges us to question how artificial the boundaries between war and peace really are. Thank you. And I should say once again, I am Margaret Stetz, the May and Robert Carter Professor of Women's Studies and Professor of Humanities at the University of Delaware. And I thank WCCW for allowing me to read that paper.
Thank you so much. Footnoting to her introduction, I wanted to add her another big contribution to this comfort women movement, which is she's the author, the co-author with Professor Banio of the Legacies of Comfort Women, that is widely read, widely cited, is one of the very first contribution and then scholarly writing. And we actually bought several copies because this one is it's not it's not anymore printed. So we had we bought a lot of copies to, if you anyone who really need this book, and please contact WCCW in our website. We can offer that. By the way, thank you so much, and it's such a very thorough overview of the problem and concepts of this sex crime, and especially for the child sex trafficking and child sex crime, which is a huge one. And this was a really knowledgeable, and we became a really knowledgeable and really truly thankful of your lecture. And before I have several points and several questions. Why don't you have any questions, the researchers? We have a research associate. We have 10 research associates. Actually, there's a lot more, some of them in Korea. Maybe Jae-hyuk, you are in Korea right now?
Yes.
Yes.
It's 9 o'clock in the morning right now.
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad that you could join in. So this is your first year trial that you are the other side of the globe. Okay, this is we are aimed at the end. Maybe next year we are spread this webinar to the other side of the globe, maybe whole world. So is there any question, research associate? Any question will be welcome.
I do have one question to
Mhm.
Professor Margaret Stetz. So, according to your lecture, there was a part that you mentioned that the Japanese prostitutes were highly restricted under the Japanese police, while the other prostitutes, I mean comfort women from other side of the countries, did not have such restrictions, right? And after the recruitment, so were they in the same environment in terms of their treatment or like medical care, or were they treated differently? Like, I would say kind of more discriminated per se.
This is not my area of expertise about the treatment of Japanese-born women who were used as prostitutes, and I would refer you to other scholars for more information about that, including Yoshimi Yoshiaki's book about comfort women. I would defer to those who have done more research in that area.
Thank you.
Yeah, but tag along to that issues, and because she already mentioned that Japanese comfort women were more than 21 years older. It's not like a 15, 13. But in addition to it, the Chinese comfort women were treated, for example, they had a intercourse more high ranked soldiers, and maybe the lesser amount of time. So definitely there is an issues of not just the gender, but also the nationality and of course the class. So it's not just the gender issues and very intersections of diverse, because most comfort women were trafficked from the poorer class or the countrysides and things like that. So it's just not issues that we can see through only the one pinhole and only the one lenses. It's much more diverse perspective should be involved. It's a good question. Yeah.
It is, yes.
Yeah. Any other questions? Or your comments is okay. Questions or your comments? Why are you thinking? Why are you thinking? I'm very interested in that when you say about the younger girls, and there is lots of maybe possible theories of these younger girls, and fully efficient and doesn't need the condoms and things like that. Maybe this is instantly came to me. Maybe the other possibility that the Asian, specifically the Japanese, has some kind of a fantasy of the younger women, not because only sexually, but because they truly believe like Zen Buddhism or the other ritual believes that the younger women has much more ki, which is energy source, energy flow. So when they have intercourse, a younger girl, I mean almost a child, they can be more invigorated. And that kind of fantasy, because when I had a seminar one time about the ukiyo-e prints and then the study about the Japanese rituals and myths and stuff like that, and I found that there is a very strong preference of having sex with a young girl, even in the Yoshiwara, like a 17th and 18th century in Japanese tradition, like a kiseng. So there are tons of different levels of a class of a kiseng. But anyway, the young girls are more treated or valuable because of that kind of health benefits. They believe that they can be more invigorated.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Very Yeah, although I would also emphasize that the fact that the Japanese soldiers were very young themselves
Mm,
is an important factor to consider. And
right.
again, if one of the chief purposes here was to reinforce power differentials, to make the soldiers feel more powerful,
Mhm,
since
mhm,
they felt powerless often in other aspects of their lives, where they were always taking orders, then
mhm,
certainly if you have very young soldiers, they
mhm,
will feel more powerful if the girls are even younger than they are.
mhm, mhm. Other questions?
Um, this is Jackie,
Mm-hmm.
and when the Korea-Japan agreement came out at the end of 2015, I
Yeah.
thought it was very odd that one was the offender, the other one was victim countries, and yet the agreement was sort of like mirror-like. The languages were almost identical.
Mm,
It says not only the offender are not to talk about in the future. I mean, that not only the victim but also the offender is not to talk about it.
yeah.
And I thought it was very unbalanced,
Yeah.
lopsided agreement.
Yes.
If Korea and Japan were both at war, if they were both equally aggressive, yes, maybe that agreement could be viewed as a gesture toward future peace or reconciliation, a step closer. But when was absolute aggressor and offender, the other one was
Mm-hmm.
nothing but victim, and
Mm-hmm.
the agreement language is almost identical.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, 2 months later, when Japan violated that agreement and spoke officially in the international arena,
Mm-hmm.
denying all their actions and history,
Yes.
by Japan doing that, doesn't that automatically relieve Korea also? Therefore, Korea can talk about this issue continually since Japan violated that agreement first.
Uh, well, you raise a very interesting diplomatic question, and I'm sure that government representatives would have a great deal to say about this. Unfortunately, of course, I can't speak for either government. All I can say is that it did seem extremely odd to me that the agreement wouldn't have committed Japan to speak rather than to be silent, that it wouldn't have committed Japan to educate on this topic, to educate the Japanese, to educate the world. That certainly is what I think most people would have expected.
Mhm,
Oh, thank you, Professor Stetz. You just raised a very important issue. If the agreement requires the victim to be silent,
Mm.
then it should have required the aggressor to admit and speak about it openly and acknowledge it.
I
But
think that's what many people would have expected, yes.
yeah, the one
and
of the biggest, I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead.
um, we have a law student actually among the research associate members. So I don't know, maybe this is something that the people in the law profession can explore because Japan, even though it's not legally binding agreement between two countries, just on the, I guess, just the principle, because one party violated, it released the other party from obligation. And they are no longer, in my opinion, Korea is no longer under obligation to uphold and honor the agreement. I think something that the legal professions or law students maybe can explore further.
The one of the biggest the lacks in that agreement is the education. It's about education, and that is our topic today. So why don't we focus on the various ways of educating the school, like a high schooler or undergraduate student in the seminar, and at the same time the public educations.
Yes.
That is clearly indicated in our WCCW mission statements. And then we do the various ways that we have been involved in symposium and forums and exhibitions and hand out some brochures, and I feel like it's not enough or it's not that much effective. So why don't we have, I need a younger brain like you. There is a much more effective way or a much more strong way to educate these peoples. I mean, the old people should know about it. I'm gonna start. Let me just start with the one examples, maybe one possible way. I was invited in the Southern SMU, Southern Methodist University in Texas. They have human rights departments. In US, there are 7 human rights departments. They are 5th human rights department. And they found comfort women issues because they're working on the all possible violation against the human rights. And they studied about the Holocaust issues and Africans and or the slave issues and so many issues, and they found these issues. So they want us to organize some symposium. They want to invite the victims, survivors, and they want to invite the directors of the movie related to these themes. And so we had a big events over there the last April. And then also I was invited in the Denver. There is the big association, big conferences of a Korean school in US, the Korean school. There's like a Sunday schools and or the Korean schools for the younger generation. They never ever taught about these issues, but this is for the first time. They want me to talk about it, how they can incorporating to the Korean school with these issues. So I had a really hard time to make this PowerPoint, but anyway, it was very successful because I noticed that so many of the teachers, the Korean teachers in Korean school, never ever be exposed these issues. So I had 2 feelings. I had very fulfilling and very rewarding trip, but at the same time, I felt like we were working only in certain arena. It should be more proliferated, this system, unexplored fields. And the other things that I thought is there is a memorial. The ones we have a memorial is just like, for event, specific event, once a year anniversary, and we don't really utilize this site. So one thing that I think is maybe create some kind of field trip courses, and then that packets, the thing that we have some educational packets and content, and hand out to the teachers, history teachers or undergraduate or some departments or wherever, whoever might be interested in it. We just hand out the packets. Whether they choose it or not is their choice, but at least we have to have a content. It was a great victory in the California about the pass the law, and then they can teach these issues to the students. They're still struggling what to teach, and we have to have a content first, and then we have to find the spots, the places that we can send them out. This is another strategy that I can think of. So I need your inputs and your suggestion how we can teach, how we can educate the people.
Would somebody else like to jump in and offer some suggestions? I mean, my own sense is that what moves the undergraduates that I teach is what they see on the web. That everything comes to them or through their phones. Everything that they learn, that they want to learn, they get from a screen. And that if there is some web-related content that grips them through, I don't know what, a fictionalized version, a TV series, documentaries made by young people, something that they access on their screens, that seems to be their preferred mode of
Yeah, I think this is great. Actually, we were contacted by many, like a younger generation. They want to write a paper, dissertation, or they want to write a poem, or making some theater. There are so many artistic or academic production they wanted to produce. So what we have to do is, this webinar is great, and whatever we collect the papers or primary sources and whatever, we wanted to put, maybe we can start just a simple Dropbox. And whoever wanted to access that material would just add the name to share the folder. It's an easy thing. But we need a more systematic, more broad repository that we have to build. Once the jumping the Johns Hopkins, they it's kind of in the middle of fundraising. So once the
I'm sorry, can I
yeah,
interrupt you for a second?
yeah, of course.
We're still recording. Do you want me to stop the recording
Uh,
or let it
yeah.
continue?
No, yeah, I think it's a
Is it okay to
maybe.
continue?
Yeah, is it okay to continue? I think it's okay. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Why don't you? And then the other ways. Why don't you, Eileen, explain a little bit about? There are three bicyclers came from Korea today. I mean, not today. They started their journey around June, and then they traveled to across the nation from west to here. I think it took almost 2 months or something. So they had a press conference at the Comparable Memory in Fairfax County, and their reason of doing this is to promote and then educate to the like because they had to stop by a little tiny village, and then whenever they stop by, they posting what they have, they handed out something and things like that. So Eileen, because I had a class today, I couldn't be there, but our executive secretary Eileen was there. Can you share with us what they did today? I can't hear you.
You need to unmute, Eileen.
Can you hear me
Unmute.
now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Um, they were here, they arrived here yesterday, actually, and they had traveled they started from LA, and this actually started last year, and these are, I guess, like, the second session, and
They
they,
have a name, right? They have a name. Triple?
yeah, they're called AAA.
Mhm.
And so the AAA is it's the first three letters of three words that represent kind of what they're doing. So it's admit, apologize, and accompany. And so they're trying to raise awareness and promote this project, saying that the Japanese government has to admit and fully acknowledge like their responsibility and apologize, and then accompany the survivors. So they're actually holding a Wednesday demonstration tomorrow in front of the Japanese embassy here. And also they're holding another event on Saturday, and they're inviting anyone to ride with them through DC, and they will be visiting a couple memorials, like the World War II memorials, the Korean War memorials, and they're hoping this will raise more awareness. And they have been holding these Wednesday demonstrations at major cities where they've been visiting, Texas, Chicago, and their final destination in New York in front of the Japanese consulate. So while they're traveling, they're meeting all these different people, and since they're riding through smaller towns where this issue is not as well known, they found that out that there are still a lot of people in America that are not aware of this, that they don't know this thing even happened.
Yes.
They're pretty shocked, but they're very supportive, and they emphasize that that this is more of a human rights issue, and they are worried because a lot of people use this very politically. So that was one thing they emphasized a lot during the press conference today.
Thank you so much.
And they wish to continue this every year, and they are trying to find ways to kind of contact a lot more students and like in universities and any like academic places. But since they are college students, they do this during their summer vacation. So that means, it's summer vacation here, so a lot of students are in school, and also a lot of like faculty and staffs aren't, here anymore. So that seems to be the issue also. And a lot of like local news would cover them, but of course, like at major cities, like big broadcasting, they really don't cover this. So they're trying to find ways to kind of do that.
I think their role is very significant, as you said, to stop that small cities, small village. This comfort women issues is exposed mainly starting from the Washington, D.C., because the WCCW was founded in 1992, and then New York and mostly the California and Chicago is another big the cities, big four. And after our founding president moved to the Florida is another very strong advocator, and Texas is just signifying their fervors and interest. But other than that, I noticed that so many cities, even the big cities, were totally ignorant about these issues. So there's a lot more places to spread out the word and then find these, share this educational tool.
Eileen?
Yes.
Do you know those three cyclists? Do you know whether they have Facebook or other social media?
They have Facebook.
They have a Facebook page that they've been updating their journey. So they try to update every few days on their journey, like who they met, if they are using, they sometimes use
Do they have Twitter as well?
Shower. No, not Twitter, just Facebook.
Okay. 'Cause,
So
yeah, I think they usually it's to gain more return on their effort and time. I think social media must be utilized, and just using one Facebook outlet, maybe they should use multiple social media outlets, and then when they do that, other civic organizations in different cities can sort of tap into it, get connected, and then from there, it's very easy to spread the news and their cause, what they're doing, things like that.
Yeah, we have a 5 minutes, only the 5 minutes left, because the professor should prepare, her lecture tomorrow, maybe. So last, maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
This is Esther Song, and I'm also participating from Korea. And
another one. Okay, hi Esther.
Nice to meet you. And first, I just want to ask, how many percentage did the children take among the whole comfort women? Because the professor told about Filipino comfort women's, but I just wonder where did you get the statistics? And I also want to ask if you have another other statistics for Korean women and Chinese women, and is it? I wonder if it is enough to call the compared to women issue as child sex trafficking.
So far as I know, there are no statistics. That nobody has been able to do any kind of rigorous study because we have only the survivors' testimonies to use. The survivors themselves report the age at which they were raped, at which they were trafficked, and it means reading a great many survivors' testimonies to get a sense of how old the girls were. If anybody knows of any larger studies of this subject of age in terms of statistical tables, I'd be very grateful to hear about them.
Okay, thank you, and I'm also preparing for the screening of Spirit's Homecoming in Korean Guyang with my friends in DC this October. We will have a screening in George Washington University, Georgetown University, and American University from 5th August to 7th August, and the director will visit DC to talk after the screening. And so I will meet the director 4 days after in Korea, and I just I thought that there is a United Nations Girls' Day, so I thought that it is good to promote it as a girls' issue, but I was wondering if it is if it is enough to call the issue as a girls' issue, because if most of the compared to women, if I don't have correct statistics, maybe some Japan students or other students can raise an issue, a question, if we have enough statistics. So,
well, I think those who want to deny will deny no matter what statistics you offer them. Obviously, those who choose to deny the testimony of the survivors will also deny that the girls were the age that they said that they were. If they have been saying all along, the deniers have been saying all along that the survivors are liars, then certainly they are likely to say that they are lying when they say they had not begun menstruating yet, that they were only 12 years old, etc. I don't know that you can ever fully convince those who willfully disbelieve. And I don't know that that should be where to put the majority of our energies either. I mean, there are people who, no matter what you produce in the way of evidence, will go on refusing to change their position. But I think all we can try to do is to educate a wider populace that is not set in its beliefs, that is not out to deny the experience of the survivors and reach them.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Esther, footnoting to the Professor Stetz's answer, importance of oral testimony, oral tradition is getting more and more important. And during the seminar organized by the Mindy Kotler in Washington, D.C. last March, we had all different national scholars and writers about comfort women. We had a Dutch journalist, we had writers about the Philippine comfort women, and they compile in their own way. They created some kind of archive, especially the Dutch archive is really, really useful. So if you contact me later personally, I can share the archives that you can see more tangible, physical statistics and numbers and stuff. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Since we don't have much time, I just wanted to advertise two things. WCCW sponsored and organized exhibition and seminar and publication in John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York and Manhattan. The opening reception will be September 15th. September 15th. It opens September 8th, but the college president wanted to join in the opening reception. The only available day for him is the 15th. So 15th and 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. So if you wanted to join in, and it will be really appreciated. And also the symposium will be October 17th. And I really wanted to narrow down the speakers who can present these issues in very succinct way, because we don't have much time for that. And then this webinar session is, as I said, is kind of wrapping up today. But after you finish, a lot of you writing your papers in here, or you still researching in an archive. And if you have something, even though that's in progress, I'm going to organize some forum at the Congress maybe sometime in November. So the webinar session, this tape recording, and then we're going to see online is over, but the webinar itself is not over. It will be wrapped up around November. And then second webinar session will be start next January, 2017 January, in much mature form. Okay, so we kind of are practicing all the time to get into the online. And second announcement is lots of people shopping at the Amazon.com. So if you go, not just Amazon.com, but smile.amazon.com, and then you are supposed to select some organization that you wanted to support. So just to select the WCCW. And then whatever you purchase over there, 0.5% of your purchase will be donated to our organization. So please spread out this word. Thank you so much, Professor Stetz. Thank you so much.
I'm very grateful.
Thank you for everybody. Okay, thank you. 지금 이제 you can stop now. 민 선생님.